Hey guys, it's Mr. Lynch and Anya. We're going to explain Walt Rostow's development or modernization model. Oh, my cat's meowing if you hear her in the background. She wants some food. And if the baby fusses, she also wants food. So when we think about Rostow and a development model, he's attempting to explain why and how countries can improve their levels of economic development. And so when we think about economic development, it's the economic and social advancement of quality of life and standard of living of a group of people. Yeah, that's right. And so if you want to, you can review the notes from previously that talked about the indicators that we looked at for economic development, especially the Human Development Index as developed by the United Nations. So unlike those dependency theories, Wallerstein and other dependency theories, Rostow believed that countries could progress through various stages of development by accepting international trade and really relying on those neoliberal economic policies and systems. And by doing that, they could advance themselves economically. And so when we think about Rostow, he says that countries and states, people go through 5 stages of development. The first stage is a traditional society, largely subsistence agriculture or hunting and gathering. And subsistence agriculture is providing food for yourself and your family, not much else for profit. So most of their economy, if not all, is engaged in the primary sector, the extractive industries. They have limited technology and limited access to technological advances in science as well. We have small-scale irrigation, perhaps, but nothing large-scale across the entire country. There's no centralization of nations or political systems, and this is why we have that limited access to technology. And then there's a lack of social and economic class mobility. So when we think about that, if you were born into a certain role within society, that would be your role for the rest of your life, and then your children and their children and all of that stuff afterwards. Oh yeah, someone's excited about this one. The next stage is the preconditions for takeoff. An external demand for raw materials initiates some sort of economic change within the country. So oftentimes what we see is some sort of external power comes in and stimulates economic growth through demand for raw materials or access to raw materials. So they will have a limited advancement economically and in certain industries, usually cash crops or raw materials for export, so oil, minerals, and the like. What we start to then see is that we see some widespread changes occurring in technology where irrigation can start to be moved to whole populations, canals start to be produced so that we can actually move these raw materials throughout the economy and throughout the system. We also start to see advancing scientific knowledge and then changing social structures with the kind of beginning points of social mobility and the beginning of national identity being formed, right? So people believing that they are all the same as a nation. Then we can move into the next stage, which is the takeoff stage. This is where large movements of population occur. We're no longer a rural system. We're starting to become urbanized, and so people start to move into urban areas as we move away from that very traditional mode of feeding ourselves. We start to expand into secondary sectors for economic production. So our country starts to produce their own manufacturing and their own industry outside of those that initially came in from external forces. Typically the first kind of industries that expand are textiles or light industries. These are the ones that are easiest, ooh, you okay? Yeah, easiest to kind of process and manufacture yourself. And then the technologies that have been adopted in preconditions are now going to be used within most of the manufacturing process as well. The next stage after this initial level of development has occurred and this initial level of investment is the drive to maturity, where now any sort of technologies that existed in the minimal industries that existed in the takeoff stage are now going to expand, and we're going to expand to new types of industries. So we're going to move away from capital goods, those types of products that are used in further production, so machines and equipment, and now our industries are going to move towards consumer goods, those things that people can purchase to improve their daily lives and make their lives easier. The other thing that we see is in the takeoff stage, we maybe had railways, roadways, waterways, being invested in and being pushed in the country, but now this is going to be widespread and it's going to develop much more rapidly, become more efficient. Even up here in these preconditions with transportation, that would have been an external force that was kind of building all of these. So think of the rail systems in India for the British and any sort of colonizer in Africa building their own transportation networks. Other things that we see in the drive to maturity is now a lot of the investment that was happening, we aren't necessarily receiving external investment anymore. Now it's more internal because we are producing and we're starting to make things that can be exported. We're going to reinvest that in social infrastructure that will further improve the quality of our life. So we invest in schools and hospitals and universities and libraries, museums and so forth. And then finally, the last stage is what we call the age of mass consumption or high mass consumption. Essentially, we've moved away from primary sector economy. Not many people working in that. Either it's mechanized or it's been outsourced. And industry is really the base of our economic production at this point. And now, if we are in this stage up here, we can be the type of person who is going to come way up here and start to initiate change in another country by having demand for raw materials to further produce for ourselves. The other thing that we see in this age of high mass consumption is the consumption of high value consumer goods throughout our country and our economy, right? So fridges, ovens, cars, multiple TVs, 18,000 cell phones, right? There is a stage beyond this that Rostow goes over, but really these are the first 5 stages and they're kind of integral and important in understanding all of his idea, right? All of his ideas. So essentially what he believes is that every single country in the world and every single people can go through these 5 stages of development. It's not all going to happen at the same time. Different countries will advance at different points in time, and it will take different initiators to move people from traditional to this preconditions for takeoff in different aspects and different... what do you want? What's going on? And in different parts of the world. So when we see colonization occurring in Southeast Asia and Africa, that's really where we move from traditional societies into the preconditions for takeoff for those countries. The other thing, where I kind of cut off here for the age of mass consumption, consumers have disposable income so that we can spend beyond our basic needs, which allow us to buy, 47 pairs of shoes. And then we are highly urbanized as an entire society at this point in time. Oh, somebody's getting fussy. Oh, and we've dropped the elephant. We have dropped the elephant. Criticisms for the theory. When Rostow was developing this theory, he was really looking at the Western world and the ideas that advanced economies of the West were the best ways, and the economic policies and decision-making of Western worlds were the best way for growth to occur. The other criticisms is that Rostow did believe that once you kind of move up the levels, you start to have this growth that would occur automatically within your country. But what we've seen even after with decolonization is that we haven't necessarily always seen growth occur, despite the fact that some of these countries had that external power come in and have demand for raw materials. And essentially these countries should have progressed further in some regards, and some of them haven't. The other thing is that he believed that countries couldn't really regress, but we've seen with the collapse of the Soviet Union that countries like Russia do regress, and they go backward from the age of high mass consumption back to things like takeoff or drive to maturity. The last thing here is that he doesn't believe that countries will be locked into situations of dependence on their exports of goods, and they won't become export economies or export-only economies. And that is something that is, when we think about criticisms, that's what we look at with Wallerstein's world system model and other dependency models, right? Where we have the core who are in that high-producing services and industries as the base of their economy. They are producing items, selling it to the semi-periphery, selling it to the periphery, and the periphery is being exploited for cheap land, cheap labor, cheap raw materials by the semi-periphery and by the core. Rostow doesn't believe that this situation exists, that the periphery is kind of stuck at the edges and stuck on the margins, whereas Wallerstein and other people who follow dependency theory think you know what, they are stuck here and they won't really economically develop. They won't reach levels of development that are advanced if they're in the periphery because they're going to be exploited continuously by the core. And as countries move from peripheral to semi-peripheral, the core countries will then just export or outsource their production to somewhere else where they can pay people even lower wages. A new periphery is identified. So that essentially is the Rostow model of development with a little bit of Wallerstein in there as a criticism of Rostow. Say bye. No? Okay.